Hello, and welcome to this ISS webinar in which we'll discuss the security, political, and economic implications of COVID-19 for the Sahel. My name is Virginia Comolli. I'm responsible for the Conflict, Security, and Development Program at ISS. And with me is my colleague, research analyst Flore Berger, who is our Sahel specialist. The content of today's presentations is drawn from a paper that we released this week, COVID-19 Implications for the Sahel, and we should have reached your inboxes by now. If not, it's available for download on the ISS website. This is part of a series of papers on the theme of stability in the time of COVID-19 that we are producing monthly, and in which we analyze the way the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting stability in different parts of the world, touching on security, governance, trade, and geoeconomic aspects. So as a way of preview, next month we'll look at how trade and supply chains have been affected in Asia and what can be expected going forward. The series is made possible thanks to a grant by PMI through their PMI Impact Initiative. So thank you to our PMI colleagues who I know who are listening in today. Before we properly start, just a couple of housekeeping points. First, following our opening remarks, we'd love to hear your feedback and questions. So please type them in the chat and we'll do our best to address them in the latter part of the webinar. Second, we are recording the webinar, so if you like to watch it again or share it with your colleagues, the recording will be available in the next 24 hours on our YouTube channel or the ISS website. So it is not a complete coincidence that so many of you decided to tune in today. This is a rather interesting week for the Sahel, given the G5 Sahel Summit in Nouakchott on the 30th and Monday's renewal of the MINUSMA mandate. Obviously, this is all happening whilst the COVID-19 pandemic is ongoing. And although its spread in the region has been less severe than in parts of Europe or Asia or the Americas, its impact, directly or indirectly, is far from negligible. So on that note, I'll first invite Fleur to share some reflections about this week's event and also on the way the security challenges, which were indeed the focus of the summit this week, intersect with the pandemic. So Fleur, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Virginia, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So indeed, before getting into the topic, I wanted to just have a mention. So the first one is the UN Security Council renewing the UN peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA, renewing its mandate for another year. There hasn't been any major change this year in its mandate, so there was no cut in personnel. So we're still at about 13,000 soldiers and 2,000 police officers, and a slight increase in budget of 1.2 billion annually. So as I said, nothing really new this year, except a few tweaks, for example, in terms of early warnings for the MINUSMA. But I think it's interesting to mention it first to remember that every year the UN Security Council has to decide to renew the peacekeeping operation, but also because every year we see tension in the UN Security Council between the US, the United States, who want less of the MINUSMA because it thinks it's too costly, too ineffective, and France who needs the MINUSMA and so always says that it's essential for its mission. And we also see a lot of talk about challenges and how the mission is failing in so many ways, etc. But at the end of the day, everyone realized that there's no alternative, and so its mandate gets renewed. The other big event of the week, as Virginia also said, is the G5 Sahel Summit in Nouakchott 2 days ago on Tuesday. And this was quite an important one for France and its partners because it comes 6 months after the Po Summit in January, where it was kind of a fresh start for everyone, and they launched new framework of cooperation, the so-called Sahel Coalition, and they had new priorities, etc. So this was the time where it was time to assess the progresses and set new milestones. And so the French came in very positive in the summit, basically saying that the situation had improved in the Sahel, that they had conducted a lot of military operations that were successful in neutralizing jihadists, militants, and also, of course, the killing of the head of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb earlier in June. My view is a bit more nuanced. I think obviously they had tactical victories, and that is for sure. In the Liptako-Gourma, so the border area between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, they had indeed some tactical victories, but we're not anywhere near any kind of victory, whatever that means. And I think if the 7 years of French presence and counterterrorism has, shown us something, is that if victory is possible, it's not going to be a military one, because the problem, the root of the instability in the Sahel is first and foremost a political and governance problem that we're trying to fix with military tools. So that's why I want to spend now a bit of time on the political aspect, and we can go back to security in the Q&A. So please feel free to ask questions about the security situation also. So first, I'd like to talk about politics in time of COVID, and then I'll talk quickly also a bit about election. So the politics in time of COVID, I want to talk about this first because it's the topic of the paper we wrote with Virginia, and also because these days it's very difficult to have any kind of discussion without mentioning the pandemic. But more importantly, I think it really, the pandemic has shown and emphasized the inability of Sahelian states to provide basic services. There's nothing new there. It's not like because of the pandemic things have started to fall apart. This has been going on for decades, but they appear even stronger during the pandemic. So to understand a bit what has been happening, we need to distinguish between, as often in the Sahel and elsewhere, between the urban centers and peripheral areas. So if we start with the periphery, first of all, the virus didn't spread extensively there, though the numbers are unreliable because of the limited testing. But what we can actually measure in a better way is, and what we know is that states have limited reach, if any, in these areas, and most people do not have access to testing or treatment facilities. So they generally, during the pandemic or not, they expect very little assistance if they get sick. And emergency situation, and states take strong measures such as lockdowns and restriction of movements, etc. Even in this emergency setting, those people living in the periphery feel that they're anyway kind of outside of the state remit, and that they have to manage themselves on their own. It's not the state that's going to come and help them. And I think just one example to illustrate the limited reach of the states, end of March, Niger banned collective prayers and decided to close all mosques. So obviously this is about 2 weeks before Ramadan starts. And so outside of urban centers, and by that I mean mostly capitals and a few other large cities, most mosques remained open and people continue to pray as they would normally do. They just don't feel that the measures that are taken in Niamey, the capital, is even applicable to them in a sense, and the state has no means to actually implement those measures anyway. So that's how limited their reach is. And in addition, there is low awareness of the pandemic among the population, and also generally a lot of mistrust towards the authority. And so we've seen a lot of conspiracy theories all over social media about how the government was making this virus up, how it actually wasn't existing. So that's the kind of picture that we have in the periphery. Now in urban centers, obviously it's quite different, because there the state is actually present and has taken measures that they're capable of implementing, and so they have a direct impact on the people. And what we've seen there is considerable backlash and resentment against these lockdown measures taken by the states. And again, just a couple of examples. If I take the same example, the Niger one, imposing a ban on collective prayers. in urban areas, in various cities, it degenerated into violent clashes mid-April, so just before Ramadan, and between the worshippers and state security forces. And hundreds of Nigerians were arrested following those clashes. And at the end of the day, this ban was not enforced since Ramadan started. And we've seen that all over in Ouagadougou, in Burkina Faso, also when they wanted to close the markets, there was considerable backlash. They ended up opening the two big ones in Ouagadougou, but then this led to more clashes and more protests asking for all the markets in the country to be reopened. And, you know, in terms of protests, like they've been banned and violently repressed all throughout this period. And people have started to say that, you know, the state is actually using the pandemic to undermine civil liberties and that they are abusing their power. I don't think this is like true in the sense that they're not using the pandemic to repress. They were doing that before and they're gonna do that after. It's not, you know, something that just appeared with the pandemic, but what matters is the perception, and the perception in urban centers is that the state is, you know, using this pandemic to repress the protests. So that's the kind of relationship you see between, you know, the population and their government. That's, you know, how deep the issue is. And as I said, it's not new. It's not something that came up with the pandemic. It's just years and years of bad governance, and people are, you know, not happy with it, and they don't want to bear the consequences of this anymore. And now turning on to the election front. Obviously, if we talk about politics and state legitimacy and good governance, elections are important and are often a watershed moment, either for good or, you know, for worse. And this is particularly interesting for the region that we cover in the paper because Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they all have elections scheduled for 2020. So the legislative election already took place in Mali in March and April. In Burkina Faso, they're holding presidential, parliamentary, plus a referendum on the constitution in November 2020. So far, it seems that it's going to take place. And in Niger, presidential elections also in December 2020, and there we're expecting a power transition because President Issoufou cannot run again. And so I think it's important to see again how big the gap is between the government and the people. And in Mali, where the election already took place, like I said, we see the consequences of, you know, rushed election, if I can say it like that. So we've seen a huge demonstration on the 5th and the 19th of June. And, you know, tens of thousands taking the streets in Bamako. They're not just like small protests here and there, they're massive. And yes, people are taking the streets because they're frustrated with the security situation and they don't understand how so many soldiers and so much money and so many initiatives can only lead to a deterioration of the situation. But that's not the main thing. That's not really why, well, that's not the only reason, at least. And the elections actually were really the trigger for this protest. First of all, because they were not held in good conditions. I mean, it was at the peak of the pandemic in March and April, where sanitary measures were the strictest. Obviously, the state of insecurity was a major problem and a concern for people to go and vote, but also because the main opposition leader, Soumaïla Cissé, was kidnapped while campaigning. And now it's been more than 3 months. Actually, today, I think it's 100 days since he's been kidnapped and he's still being held captive. You know, nothing has, well, the government hasn't managed for now to get his release. So the vote took place anyway, a very low turnout, obviously an all-time low of 12% in Bamako. And then the Constitutional Court overturned the results and for about 30 seats in the parliament. And the presidential party got 10 more seats than, you know, what was previously announced. And so that was really the trigger for the various protests. And then I'll skip the back and forth between the many actors involved, etc. I mean, I don't have time to really go into the details here. But the point is that instead of having legislative elections, which were, you know, people really waited on these elections to be represented, etc. Instead of, you know, this election reinforcing state legitimacy, which is really important, and, you know, the state being able to prove to people that they can trust them, instead it turns into a crisis legitimacy with, you know, people not trusting their president, their parliament, and their constitutional court. And as I said, this election was just the kind of the trigger, the latest scandal. But in the streets, you have teachers and hospital workers and bankers, etc., who have been protesting for a while. And for example, the teachers, they've organized a series of strikes in 2019. And they're just fed up with the little progress on social and economic issues, and they demand better working conditions. And they're really just frustrated with years and years of bad governments. And at the end of the day, these protests are really about the failure of the government in Bamako to address people's basic needs. And so that's where the core of the issue is. And, you know, we can talk, Burkina Faso is obviously a whole other story, and there's a lot also to say about the little progress of the implementation of the peace agreement, which is a lot about the return of the states and providing basic services, etc. We can talk more about it in the Q&A. But to conclude, and I guess to go back to my first comment about the G5 Sahel summit from 2 days ago on Tuesday, I think we really see that the political aspect of the instability of the crisis is obviously not the priority, and we've known that for a while, even though, you know, it is at the root of the problem. But I would even say that it is, you know, in some way disregarded, because when Macron and his partners gather in Nouakchott and, you know, congratulate each other and explain how much the situation has improved, while Mali is having, you know, is facing its most important political crisis since 2012, when the security crisis started, I think it really shows how little, you know, the political aspect of it is on their agenda. And so in the end, how limited the results and, you know, the improvement of the situation is going to be.
Thank you very much, Flora. I can already see a number of questions coming in, which were sparked by your remarks. But before we go into that, I'd like to look at the economic side of the equation. I mean, as already alluded to by Flora, restrictions of movements and the closure of markets were among the many measures that were introduced by local governments to fight the pandemic. But those measures, albeit necessary, have indeed undermine what are already very fragile economies. And people are really struggling because of the sharp rise in the prices of food, manufacturing products, utilities, that were all as a result of the pandemic and the restrictions related to it. But I think it's worth briefly considering the bigger picture. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa as a whole is already expected to register its worst economic performance on record this year, according to IMF projections released a couple of months ago, with the economy contracting by 1.6%, as, you know, the health crisis is now precipitating an economic crisis. And specifically, I think the region is suffering because there are three economic shocks that are coalescing, you know, coming together. And one is the disruption of production and the sharp reduction in demand, for instance, in demand for agricultural products from China and other foreign markets as a result of the pandemic. Also, second is the sharp deterioration of global growth, which of course has a spillover effect into the continent. And the third factor, of course, is the severe decline in commodity prices. I mean, this is not unique to the Sahel or sub-Saharan Africa. Other regions of the world, as we know, are experiencing a similar fate. However, the situation in the Sahel is made worse by the fact that economies are already extremely fragile, and there are millions of people who live very precarious lives. In the paper, Flora and I highlight the urban and rural divide and how the pandemic is affecting, different areas and what it means for those economies. If you take the urban centers, well, those are the ones that generate the bulk of the income for a nation in most places, and certainly in this part of the world, but also are the areas worst affected by the pandemic. And we can explain why that is. And so, but specifically, we can see across, Sahel and city how small and medium-sized enterprises, which are responsible really for the lion's share of African employment, that are very, very vulnerable to shocks and the measures that were implemented as a result of the pandemic. And equally vulnerable are the tens of millions of people that are employed in the informal economy. And I think this is a very key point. Of course, figures vary a bit across the continent, but around 80% of the African workforce is within the informal economy. And here I would add a little kind of footnote that a large proportion, like over half of those informal workers, are actually female workers. And I think it's important to emphasize that, because there are many studies from World Bank, UN, and many reputable organizations that have proved how women are disproportionately affected by poverty, inequality, fragility, and conflict, all things that are already present across the Sahel. So if we look at the countryside, well, the incidence of COVID has been lower. Of course, whenever I say, things like lower, the caveat is what Flore has already mentioned, that the data is far from perfect and comprehensive. But even though the incidence has been lower, the situation isn't actually that much better. 80% of rural population in the Sahel rely on subsistence farming. And the fact that restrictions have been put in place and people have not been able to go to markets where they can sell their produce, they can buy seeds and fertilizers, of course, has a serious impact on their livelihood. In addition, whereas normally governments would be able to offer some agricultural subsidies to help with farmers, because the expenditure is now focused on responding to the pandemic, that has also a further negative impact on those farmers. And to make things worse, we are currently in the lean season for the Sahel, and already normally, in normal circumstances, food prices would be higher. So this is a further complication. The other aspect that is also worth highlighting is the impact of the closure of national borders. This has a particular effect on small traders. And this is but even worse for those landlocked countries such as Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Niger, that become unable then to reach ports in coastal West Africa, and this has been detrimental to the trade in essential goods. So with this picture in mind, and knowing that across the continent the tax to GDP ratio are already low to begin with, and that countries tend to have high debt levels, it is not surprising that governments are struggling to deal with the pandemic beyond the physical restrictions that we have already mentioned, and which in turn limit the ability to conduct business, increase food prices, and create discontent among the population, etc., etc. So in this context, international financial institutions' support in fighting the pandemic is pretty crucial. And in April, the IMF approved the disbursement of funds under the Rapid Credit Facility for a total of just under $680 million going to the 5 Sahelian countries that we are focusing on in the paper, so Mali, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Niger. And those Sahelian countries were also among the first batch of recipients of World Bank support through the COVID-19 Fast Track Facility. On top of that, the continental level, the African Union has established the African Union COVID-19 Response Fund to mitigate the humanitarian and socioeconomic impact of the pandemic. And the UK is the largest national donor, having invested about $25 million. So these responses obviously are complemented by other that are very health specific and also include greater coordination among health ministries and with the World Health Organization, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and other donors that provide direct aid to NGO and health and humanitarian actors on the ground. And this has also happened at the EU, but at the ECOWAS and also at the Sahel Alliance level. So there is really lots happening. However, and this brings me to the conclusion, or some of the conclusions that we've reached in the paper. We feel that despite the financial contributions European and other non-African nations have made to combat COVID-19 in the Sahel, it is crucial for African nations and institutions to take ownership of the response to the crisis in the long term. And there are two main reasons for that. The first one is that domestic priorities of dealing with the pandemic in donor countries do have an impact on their ability to help abroad. But also, and I think maybe this is more important, we don't want a scenario in which African countries become even further in debt. Already, as the African economies are contracting, foreign aid's contribution to national GDP is likely to rise, which means that the continent is likely to become more aid dependent in coming years. If we're trying to find a bit of a silver lining in all of this, that has to do with realizing what has been happening and the importance of greater economic integration within the continent. For instance, yes, it is true that because of the pandemic, the operationalization of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which was scheduled for July, has been postponed by at least 6 months. But the events of 2020 have also further highlighted the importance of deeper regional economic and trade integration, which can be achieved through economic diversification and the elimination of tariffs, which would indeed serve as a buffer against shocks such as the recent decline in demand from Asia and European markets that we saw as a result of COVID. So really this brings me to, I guess, one word or two words, that is, because this really speaks to the importance of building resilience. And of course, I don't simply mean economic resilience. Of course, the economic side is crucial. And in this respect, I would say that given the size, but also the vulnerability of the informal economic sector in the regions, efforts to protect informal employment should indeed be a priority during this crisis. And this includes recognizing and engaging with informal economic actors, but also acknowledging that this is a very fluid sector and there are people who move in and out on informal employment. And this really needs to be acknowledged. Then, of course, we need to talk about building resilience within the health sector. And towards, of course, many resources and many efforts have been deployed, and we've seen, for instance, initiatives to build testing capacity, to build new laboratories, train the trainer programs for health professionals, et cetera, et cetera. But we should also be mindful of lessons from the Ebola crisis in West Africa back in 2014 and 2016, because so much resources were then spent towards that pandemic, that crisis, that then resources as a result were diverted from basic healthcare spending. And as a result of that, we saw an increase in the incidence of malaria, HIV/AIDS, TB, and also maternal mortality. So in a way, I know we're talking about multiple crises and challenges happening at the same time, but if we forget about existing challenges, they're not going to go away on their own, and the situation in the post-Ebola crisis is an example of that. And finally, really, this links back to what Fleur said at the end of her remarks, and this has very much to do with governance and building the resilience of political system and strengthening institutions. And it has become almost a cliche. We know we run many discussions about the Sahel, and especially in recent months, but that always, regardless of which angle the discussion starts from, that's actually the point that we always end up on. And the importance of building or strengthening that social contract between the government and the people, which, as Flore highlighted in her presentation, seems to be, the divide seems to be widening over time. So, well, I hope that we were able to provide a flavor of what this paper was about, and that people will join in with their comments. I'm actually seeing that there are quite a few comments already coming in. They're all primarily security oriented or security focused. And perhaps I'll try, I'll ask Flore perhaps to come in with the answer first, and then I'll chip in. Yes, there are really quite a few. So I will start with the first one, Flore, and because at the very beginning of your presentation, you were talking about victory. But what do we mean by victories? What kind of strategy will take us to that victories? Or are the parties involved simply trying to manage existing difficulties in a better way?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's actually quite interesting that someone picked up on it, because I was using that word because Macron, in his press conference and the summit on Tuesday, he was the one using that phrase, and he said that he believed victory was possible after explaining how they had had so much military gains and how everything was so much better now. So that's why I used that word. And when I heard Macron saying that, I also thought, what do you mean by victory? Because if apparently your definition of victory and mine are not the same, because as I already mentioned a bit in my presentation, I don't think the situation today is better in any way that it was 6 months ago. And it's not a question of getting better or getting worse. It's just that we're not going towards victory. But what it shows is that for him, and in general for the strategy of France and the international community and the actors involved, they still believe that victory is going to be a military one. And even though they say that obviously development is important and that politics is important and that they need to make progress on that too, it's always it really comes at the end of any speech or any concrete example of what they're doing on that front. And for example, if I get back to this summit of 2 days ago, we see in the final communique, I find it quite interesting, and it's not new. It's every summit is the same. It's the same thing, but the only kind of concrete example that they put forward is always on the security front. So, for example, in that case, there was the killing of Drogdel, the ACMI Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb leader. The various military operations that were conducted, so they name Monclar, Colère de Boma, etc. So all military operations that took place in about 6 months. And they also talk about the future. So they, for example, mentioned that 3,000 soldiers from the African Union were going to be sent to the Sahel. That was mentioned a while ago, but they're going to be sent now. The 250 British soldiers being sent with the MINUSMA also later this year. Takuba operation, which is again a European, French-headed under French command, but European special forces being sent to this 3 border area of the Liptako. and Germany pledging also 120 million, if I'm not mistaken, euros in support of military effort in support of the troops. So that's how they see victory, and is mostly based on military gains in different areas of the Sahel and different military operations. But when we talk about what I would say, I mean, I wouldn't even talk about victory, but if I had to, it would really be something that is way, larger than just military victory, or a few successes here and there. But again, in this summit, on Tuesday, there was nothing about that. We have, not one example of how, for example, some of the local governors returned to their duty station in the north, or how, barely the political crisis in Mali, and, people asking for Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, the president, to leave. This was not mentioned either. So that's, the strategy is over militarized, and every new initiatives or a new framework that is supposed to lead to victory, which is, kind of stabilization of the region, is always first and foremost based on military and security aspects. And again, even when they mention a bit of other stuff like, politics and development and stuff, again, they mention it because they know they have to, but it never takes any kind of priority.
Yeah, no, thank you, Flore. And that actually, in a way, answered another question that we had, which was about what would the real mid and long-term objectives of France were in the Sahel. So that's very that's very clear. Now, there is another question that really looks at wants to discuss how significant will pandemic mitigation measures impact on security measures against the insurgents. Will they be able, this measure to disrupt insurgents' logistical chains, or just in general? How? Because there are actually a number of questions that want you to explore more the impact on the violent groups. How are they impacted by the pandemic?
So that's also an interesting question, because again, in the beginning, we've seen a lot of alarming statements saying that the groups were going to exploit the pandemic, and that they were going to step up the attacks, etc. But in fact, we have seen that these were kind of, again, political affirmations, but they did not translate it into anything on the ground. So the groups have not been impacted that much by the pandemic. First of all, because, as I said in my presentation, the virus hasn't spread that much in rural areas, and that's where that's mostly where these groups operate. We can't really see, direct and important impact on what the question asked about, the insurgents' logistical chains. So for them, it's as I wrote in the paper, business as usual, because indeed their capabilities, their equipment, their resources, whatever impacts their operations hasn't changed. And so we've seen, obviously, the dynamic of the conflict change depending on many aspects, including stuff like the seasons, or, operations by French in certain areas. So, for example, they have focused now in this area of the Liptako. So we've seen the groups moving elsewhere and reorganizing elsewhere, and meaning starting to clash elsewhere, especially in Burkina Faso. We've seen quite a lot of attacks since the beginning of the year, and they're going further south. Even, there was an attack in Côte d'Ivoire in 11th of June. So, they're just conducting their operation as they would, and they're very little impact on these groups from the pandemic.
Yeah. Thank you. I think I will also jump in on this question, because there are also a question that looks at the impact on, for instance, Al-Qaeda, which I'm happy to touch upon, but also the impact on illicit economies. And I'll start with the latter, because indeed, similarly to the impact that the restrictions have had on illicit economies, of course, illicit trafficking had to adapt as well. And this especially with regards to smuggling of goods and people. We saw that in late March, some very stringent travel restrictions were imposed by Chad and Niger, to fight the pandemic, and this had disrupted the trafficking of migrants. Also, at the same time, both Algeria and Libya had increased the deployments of border guards along, their borders to contain the pandemic. So that meant that traffickers normally operating along the Sahel-Libya route had to kind of take a temporary break. And I'm highlighting temporary because by the time restrictions were lifted in mid-April, those activity resumed. But usually the traffickers would opt for using more remote routes. And oftentimes those remote routes are also the ones that are used by arms and drug smugglers. Of course, this has an impact on the business, because those arms and drug smuggling routes tend to be kind of more violent, more dangerous. And of course, this presents higher business risk for those migrant traffickers, and now intersecting with arms and drug trafficking. And so some of those human traffickers had switched to some less dangerous businesses, such as the smuggling of fuel and gold. So yes, the pandemic has had an impact on illicit trafficking, for sure. One other question has to do with the impact on various groups, and there was a particular mention to Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and Flore had already made reference to the fact that Drogdel, the leader of AQIM, was killed by French operations supported by the Americans and possibly the Algerians at the beginning of June. And this indeed was a massive, at least primarily from a symbolic perspective, was a massive victory, because Drogdel has been a leader of the group since the very beginning, is a veteran of the Algerian Civil War and all the groups that jihadi groups that came out of it. And of course, Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb has such a key role across the region, and it has, through its funding and through the sharing of expertise, kind of train other groups from across the broader Maghreb and Sahel into kidnap for ransoms and suicide attacks. So taking out someone like that, of course, was a big win symbolically. However, I'm a bit cautious of overemphasizing that, because the power of Drogdel and AQIM had already started to wane. And I won't go into the many details of the multiple offshoots and groups breaking off and then merging back again. But really, at present, the JNIM coalition, Al-Qaeda coalition in the Sahel, is really kind of the face of Al-Qaeda in the region. So that's what people talk about. Is not AQIM, although AQIM is part of it. But the AQIM component of JNIM is not even the deadliest one. That would be the Katiba Mathina. So I think that we have seen over the past few years a decline of the Algerian leadership of AQIM and the ascent of the Malian, homegrown leadership that has become more and more prominent, and that's reflected at the heads of these groups tend to come from local areas, which means that they enjoy greater legitimacy in the eye of the population, and also they are facilitated in their recruitment because of that. So I'm not suggesting that AQIM is something from the past and it's gone away completely, but its influence had been diminished already, even before the killing of Proctel. So going back to, Flore, would you like to add anything more on groups?
No. I think you did it well.
The other thing that people are asking about, I guess, is to do with the humanitarian side of things. One of our participants is asking how COVID has affected the food supply chain in the region. The situation is particularly bad, in particular in Burkina. Would you like to take that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a few weeks, I can't remember the date now, but we had actually a webinar that was focused on the impact of COVID on humanitarian action, and we had 2 humanitarians talking. So I would also suggest to go back if someone is really interested in that aspect. But yeah, I think indeed the situation is really worrying, and in throughout the region, but in Burkina Faso in particular, because even before the pandemic, this is really a country where even 6 years ago, it was a country where people would go on holidays. And even I remember, like, as a francophone, Burkina Faso was like kind of the place where people would go on holidays if they didn't want to do like something like Kenya or something. And so when I see now Burkina Faso, and the almost we're gonna reach now soon almost 1 million IDPs. So the fastest displacement crisis on the continent. In less than 2 years, we're already reaching 1 million IDPs, and also parts of the country being completely out of the reach of the government, and towns being cut off. Big towns in the north, for example, like Djibo, being cut off from the rest of the country. I think that's really worrying, obviously, and for humanitarians, and it means that there are more and more places where they cannot go, and if they go, and even before COVID-19, it was difficult for them to reach these areas and actually help the people. Also because most IDPs are hosted by communities, so they're not in IDP camps where it's easier for humanitarians to do their job. They're actually in host communities. I think something about 90% of them, if not more. So even before the pandemic, it was very difficult to reach out to them, but now it becomes even more difficult. And I think also the humanitarians were saying they're quite worried because even in terms of funding, now it becomes very COVID related, and the number of actions that they're taking also to respond to other illnesses that continue to be a big problem in these regions. All of these problems continue despite COVID. It becomes very difficult to do their job, and they're actually quite worrying for the future also in terms, obviously, of food security. We're going to have millions and millions of people because of insecurity coupled now with this pandemic that are going to be in at risk of insufficient food. So yeah, it's very worrying. And I also received a question that is also Burkina Faso related by WhatsApp. So it's about what's happening now in Mali with the protest. Is it something that can happen in Burkina Faso if the government doesn't start addressing the root issues and the neglect in the north, etc.? And yeah, I think it's indeed very interesting because we see kind of the same mistakes that are made in Mali are obviously repeating themselves in Burkina Faso, and it's totally something that could happen in Burkina Faso too. And I would say in some ways it's even more worrying because again, in Mali, we have a history of rebellion in the north, etc. Since the independence, and even before Mali became independent. But in Burkina Faso, it went so fast, and a lot of people didn't really see it coming, and only started, realizing that there's a crisis when the country had already fallen. And in terms of, again, the political aspect, I think this year is going to be, I think quite a disaster for Burkina Faso, because, as I said, the elections are going to take place in November, even though because of the pandemic they're already late, and they have suspended the voter registration, etc. But also because politicians are likely to ally with vigilante groups to intimidate voters, or to build their popularity. And that's something that Burkina Faso is already doing in the north, so using vigilante groups to provide security. And they have even voted a law about this to make it legal, in a sense. And so they will rely also on these vigilante groups to conduct the elections. And this is clearly, as I said, a recipe for disaster, because it will only bring the divide further between the people and the government, and there will be even more abuses by these militias, and the people will feel like they have to protect themselves, and when they feel the need to protect themselves, they either join an ethnic group, not a self-defense militia, or they join jihadist groups. And so this creates a vicious circle of violence. And I find it indeed very worrying that a lot of people have been, highlighting this, but that the government still decides to rely on these militias to conduct the elections, to help them conduct the elections, and to provide security. And in the first quarter of this year, if we look at the number of attacks and civilians killed, more civilians got killed by these militias and state security forces than by jihadist groups. And we're talking hundreds, and at least 400 civilians being killed in 2 or 3 months in separate attacks by Nigerian forces, Burkina Faso forces, and Mali. And this was barely addressed again in the summit 2 days ago. And that's where things can really be done, because again, it's creating a vicious circle of violence. And in some way or another, you have to stop that. You cannot let this happen. And while everyone is going to campaign in Burkina Faso, the security aspect is going to be kind of put on the side, because campaigning is going to take all the attention, and the elections are going to take all the attention, in addition to COVID that will still be around. And so once the election is passed, the country is gonna wake up to an even worse situation. So for this year, I would say Burkina Faso is maybe more to worry about than Mali.
Flore, staying on the political theme, what would be your recommendations on how the political situation can be improved, but in the region? There is also one specific question that looks at Mali, but I think this applies to all the countries, and also from the point of view of external partners and donors. How can they contribute towards political stability?
Yeah,
I know it's not an easy thing.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it's not an easy question, and it's not an easy thing to do. And I also don't mean to say that the France should just leave and all the military should stop, and that it's fully useless. And that's not my point. I think it's necessary for sure, because there is indeed a security crisis, and there is indeed armed groups that need to be like military targeted, etc. So I think that the military is doing, if we put on the side the abuses, other than that, I think France and its military strategy is quite good in a sense. Like they know what they're doing. What is lacking is indeed the rest. So the first thing that can be done is, you know, on kind of the high level front when there's such a summit, instead of only talking about military security, number of troops, you know, and all of that, you can start, you know, talking about the other aspects and say, well, okay, you know, we conducted this operation and that was good, but we also see that the political crisis in Mali is deepening. And so you can, you know, first of all, acknowledge it, and then in the actions that you take, put it as a priority instead of just as something that, you know, people need to think about whenever they don't have anything else to do. And I mean, obviously it's difficult to be precise, I guess, in opposition to military operations, where you can say, okay, from the 3rd of March to the 23rd, we deployed 5,000 soldiers in this area. You know, this is quite concrete, but I think in terms of political progresses, you can also measure them in some way. So for example, if we talk about the redeployment of state authority, which is a big part of the peace agreement, and obviously an important part, because people need to see that the government is there, and they need to see them in their villages and their towns, and they need to see that they are the one providing security. So that's, you know, a crucial part. In early 2020, the Reconstituted Army, so this is basically from the peace agreement, it's a bit of national armed forces, then you have people from the platform, an armed group associated with the government, and then the CMA, which is the Tuareg group, part of the signatory to the agreement. So this Reconstituted Army was deployed, so some battalions were deployed in Kidal, Gao, Timbuktu, and Menaka. So 3 main towns in 4 main towns in northern Mali. So first of all, this took months, if not years, of negotiation to get at that point. But, you know, after the post-summit in January, another G5 Sahel summit, there was really this kind of, yeah, as I said in the beginning, fresh start. And so there was political will, and we saw that finally, after, as I said, months, this army was redeployed. And that's good, and, you know, that's a positive and measurable impact. But now in Timbuktu, for example, they have started to patrol and be on the main axis, so that's good. But in Kidal, which is, you know, kind of the fief of the Tuareg rebellion, where there has been no formal state presence since 2012, they have deployed, but they have not yet become operational. And so, for example, that's something where friends and the partners could, you know, put a finger on that and say, well, now, you know, this needs to happen. They arrived in February and they still haven't patrolled or become operational. Another point, for example, if we talk about return of the state, is, you know, the number of open schools or like vaccination level, etc. And an important point also is the number of civil administrators. So the MINUSMA keeps track on that in its kind of report that it does every 3 months. And the percentage of local administrators deployed to northern areas have never reached more than 20%. So it means that, you know, in northern Mali, people who, you know, live there, only 20% see like a face of the government there. So a local governor or, you know, some kind of state authority. And again, that's where progress needs to be made, and that's where the, you know, priority needs to be put instead of, you know, targeting of jihadists, you know, in this or this area.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fleur. I think that brings us to the kind of end of this webinar. I'm very grateful to everyone who registered and sent us questions, and hopefully we've satisfied your curiosity with our answers. And please, I'll invite you all just to download the paper, have a look, and send us your feedback via email, and we're always happy to to hear people's opinions and views. So we will be producing the next paper in this series, Stability in the Time of COVID, and by the end of this month. And so we'll have another webinar in early August to have in a similar format to discuss the findings of it. Well, thank you very much. I won't try to summarize what we discussed today, but once again, the webinar has been recorded, so everyone will be able to access it through the ISS website or our YouTube channel. And meanwhile, thanks again, and we'll see you at the next IISS webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you.